2020 has been a year of hypervigilance, of always waiting for the other shoe to drop, except then another shoe drops, and then a fourth shoe drops. Bit of bad news after bit of bad news. Plot twist after plot twist. Challenge after challenge. Most of us have gotten pretty good at expecting some new kind of calamity to befall us, if not daily, weekly, or monthly. Of course, a lot of our vigilance has been brought on by this pandemic that keeps plodding forward here in the 9th month of our practice of social distancing. But the summer also woke us up to some of the long-standing inequities and injustices in our country. Of course, I'm talking about the epidemic of police brutality and the long, long struggle for equity for Black and brown lives. But the challenges of this pandemic have only highlighted our nation's problems with income inequality. It has pushed our healthcare system to its limits and exposed how some members of our society, essential workers, are forced to face more dangers, more threats to their own well-being, more instability than the rest of us. In the past few years, really since 2014, when the riots in Ferguson broke out after the police killing of Michael Brown, and the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement as this re-emergence of Black consciousness and Black power movement in the U.S. You may have heard the term woke getting thrown out a lot. In the past 6 years, this term woke has come to mean something pretty generic, like anyone who is politically progressive or leans left. People on the left use it that way, and people on the right use it that way to speak negatively about people on the left. But it's important to note that the term "stay woke" originated in the emerging Black consciousness movement of the 1920s and 30s, when leading Black activists encouraged other Black Americans to wake up to the dangers posed to them by white America and the systemic racial injustice that was literally a threat to their very lives. Folks like Marcus Garvey and later the musical artist known as Leadbelly admonished their fellow Black citizens to stay woke to these dangers and to the deceptions that they would face in the face of systemic racism. This is the kind of wokeness that Jesus had been admonishing his disciples to practice in the Gospel of Mark. As the gospel winds toward its close and Jesus gets closer to Jerusalem, he warns them of the impending doom. Bad things are going to happen to them. Authoritarian rulers and false prophets are going to try to deceive them. And if they hold fast, these same corrupt leaders will persecute them, and they will suffer greatly. In Mark chapter 13, which we are reading from today, Jesus is predicting the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, which will happen in the year 70 AD. Jesus is warning his disciples to stay woke, to be vigilant, to be prepared for a long period of suffering. The question that comes next is not written explicitly into the text, but you can almost hear the disciples in the background begging for some kind of sign of relief. Yes, Jesus, we hear you. We understand. Stay woke. Be strong. Endure. Hold fast to your faith. Have patience. But what about hope? What about hope, Jesus? And Jesus begins to tell them, after the suffering, after the calamity, after the sky turns black and the heavens are shaken, there will be signs of light at the end of the tunnel, a crack in the facade. Jesus says it's like a fig tree in bloom. When you see the flowers begin to open, you know that the fruit is quickly on the way. Jesus said the hope that is coming is like the fig tree in that you will see signs of the coming relief, but it won't be nearly as predictable as blooms on a tree. No, this hope, this Advent kind of hope, is like when the master of a house leaves home for a long journey and leaves his staff in charge to take care of the task that must be done. He promises to return, but he doesn't give them a deadline, a date of arrival. He merely reassures them that he is coming back, not to let down their guard, not to slack off on the housework, not to let the property languish in disrepair, not to forget about him and the purpose of their life together, but to stay awake, to stay alert, to watch for his return, and to be about the work in the meantime. A colleague of mine, the Reverend William Lamar, who pastors the Metropolitan AME Church in Washington, D.C., says that one of the messages of Advent is that God is always coming. We don't always know precisely when God will arrive or where he will show up, but God is always coming. I sort of like to say it this way, that God is always about to come. And while we wait, we must do the work and watch, just as the master of the house admonishes his staff to do. We have to watch for where the Spirit is moving. And we don't get to procrastinate on our calling. We don't get to defer on our purpose. We don't get to wait until the pandemic is over. We don't get to wait until the new president is inaugurated. We don't get to wait until the new pastor comes, or until all of our affairs are in order, or our lives are in tip-top shape. We don't get to wait until we've figured out the proper exercise routine, or have gotten enough sleep, or have the perfect job, or our dream house. Advent starts today with everything yet unresolved, with the same problems we've been dealing with for almost 9 months, or 4 years, or 400 years. Nevertheless, Advent starts today. And in the midst of all that is yet unresolved, Jesus calls us to hope. Not to an emotion, but to the practice, to the discipline of hope. Some scholars believe that the Gospel of Mark was written by John Mark, protege of the Apostle Paul, who is mentioned later on in the New Testament. If this is true, then John Mark probably inherited much of the Pauline worldview. That there is this inherent struggle between the reign of Christ and the reign of the powers and principalities of this world. And in the Pauline worldview, hope is a dogged and deliberate choice when the world seems dark. And you have to practice it like a difficult solo on the violin. It is a spiritual discipline. A couple years ago, in 2018, I was able to take a trip to Washington, D.C. with some colleagues to visit the National Museum of African American History and Culture. If you ever get a chance to visit, I encourage you to take it and spend as many hours as you can. We were lucky on our trip to be guided by the Reverend Dr. Brad Braxton, a scholar of the New Testament, and at the time, one of those in charge of the museum's portrayal of African American religious history, which of course is a dominant thread throughout the history of African Americans in this country. After we had had a chance to tour the major exhibits of the museum, our group gathered in one of the classrooms, and Dr. Braxton asked us to reflect on what we had seen. The suffering, the pain, the abuse, the cruelty, the dehumanization of people of color, and the way that white folks had lost their souls along the way. We all had lots to say about the pain that we had observed in these exhibits. But as the conversation meandered on, Dr. Braxton stopped us at one point and said, "Now, what about the hope? What about the hope that you saw?" There was silence. Like so many of us on that trip, I had forgotten to look for the hope. We had to work hard and think back, look between the major headlines, look past the big labels into the fine print written about each display. On one of these extended explanations, a story was told about a slave woman who worked in the fields of a plantation, long hours from dawn till dusk, and went back to her own living quarters after dark to attend her own small garden plot late in the evening. Her own plot of land where she was free to grow and nurture whatever her heart desired. Another story written down alongside this exhibit of a small brown sack embroidered with a story about several generations of women who could be traced back to a slave woman named Rose and her daughter Ashley. Rose had given this small embroidered sack to her daughter Ashley when her daughter was sold away to a different plantation. In it, it was said that Rose placed a dress, some pecans, and all of her love for her daughter. The sack eventually was passed down to Ashley's granddaughter, Ruth, who embroidered the sack with the actual story of this mother-daughter relationship. This emblem of love passing down from generation to generation during the harshest of circumstances, standing the test of time and giving testimony to the resilience of the slave communities, to the kind of hope that they nurtured and practiced and learned to live in spite of this despair that surrounded them. Dr. William Barber says that's what hope does. Hope rises up through despair. Hope is not what you feel when things are going well. It's not even optimism about the future. Hope says that in spite of how bleak things are, in spite of how horrible our prospects look, in spite of everything that I can see with my eyes, my spirit says that something new is possible, that God is always coming, that she is always nurturing love and hope and freedom in our souls and in the world around us. The architecture of the museum itself gives testimony to this hope rising up through despair, with hands that are etched into the side of this facade, hands reaching heavenward, up out of the muck and the mire. This is what woke people in marginalized communities and suffering servants throughout time have been showing us all these years. How to nurture hope and how to watch and to do your work until God shows up in real time. There's an African proverb that I keep on my desk. It says, "Smooth seas do not make skillful sailors." Although we would be mistaken to glorify suffering, part of the core of the Christian tradition teaches us that suffering is so often what molds us into the mature spiritual beings that we need to be in order to truly follow Christ's call. My hope is that these 9 months and counting of this pandemic life are molding us into skillful sailors. I think we have 2 options. We have the option of letting the circumstances that we're in make us complacent, despairing, bitter even, or as the gospel says, prone to just fall asleep until it's all over. But Jesus says to us, that's not an option. Stay woke. We don't get to procrastinate on our calling. We don't get to defer on our purpose. We don't get to wait until the pandemic is over or the new president is inaugurated. We don't get to wait until the new pastor comes or all our affairs are in order and our lives are in tip-top shape. Advent starts today with everything yet unresolved. Amen.